This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome after a really long time to another episode of World to Win. I'm super excited to see Toya again, who I haven't seen in what is actually months. How are you doing, Toya?
I've been great. Well needed break. I had a baby, which is so exciting. It's so fun. Yes, it's really great. So I'm glad we were able to take some time off, learning how to be a mom. Your instincts do kick in, but it's not the easiest job in the world if I have to say so. But it's just been an amazing experience. And I mean, for us to be coming back on this episode talking about healthcare, Yaara, it is just perfect because bringing the baby to the doctor all the time, and I mean, just even the whole process of dealing with giving birth in a hospital. I mean, I'm tens of thousands of dollars in debt now just because I had a baby. It's absolutely insane. So I'm really excited to talk about, the healthcare system around the world today, and also hear some exciting reports of people trying to make conditions better for workers and patients.
Yeah, I mean, I think every time we talk and you tell me how much something costs in the US when it comes to healthcare, I'm completely shocked. So, I don't stop being shocked by it. But I think, around the world, we've seen kind of how we all know how important healthcare workers are. But in the last few years, it's been even more, glaring. And everyone's been talking about essential workers, healthcare workers being so important. And obviously we know that during the pandemic, healthcare workers have gone through probably one of the most difficult times to be a healthcare worker. Not that it's easy any other time. But we really relied on the work, and it's just the role of healthcare workers in fighting the pandemic generally is just undeniable, and also healthcare workers obviously suffered a disproportionate amount of COVID cases themselves and COVID deaths as well as physical and mental issues relying to that, and the extra hours and really tough labor that came along with such a massive global pandemic is clearly kind of showing its toll and has been showing its toll in the last few years. And we are seeing especially doctors and nurses at the eye of the storm of the pandemic. But even though the pandemic maybe is not on the headlines as much as it used to be, it's not over for nurses and healthcare workers and their the role in society. And I think it's also important to mention that it's a female-oriented sector, right? Women are disproportionately affected by the issues caused by the pandemic generally, but especially in the healthcare sector. And that the oppression of women and gender-based oppression generally goes hand in hand with this crisis of capitalism and the crisis in the healthcare sector. And I think it's clear to everyone, generally we're seeing kind of all of the strike action and all of the anger of workers, but in the healthcare sector, I think it's been happening in particular, and we're seeing that in a much higher scale all across the globe. And this is what we're going to talk about today. I think most people watching will know that the 12th of May, I think it's the 6th of May in the US, but globally it's the 12th of May, is International Nurses Day. So we're going to do this episode about healthcare, and we're not just going to talk about, nurses or just going to talk about the healthcare sector regarding this particular day, but we're also going to put it in context. We're going to talk about the neoliberal era, privatization and its impact on healthcare. We're going to talk about how globally healthcare systems have fallen into such a state of crisis that was highlighted by the pandemic. And we're going to also see, the other side of it, the fight back against it, the struggles over the last period, and the radicalization that's taking place within the sector specifically. And then also we're going to explain how even basic, let alone high quality public healthcare is just simply not possible under capitalism. And again, I think the pandemic showed us the issues that are in the way of creating a system like that within capitalism. So I think this is going to be definitely a really interesting episode. And I think, maybe Toya, you can bring some of your experience lately from the other side of not being a healthcare worker, but interacting with the healthcare sector so much in this episode.
Yeah, and it's perfect timing with it being, here in the US, National Workers Week. My friend who's a nurse said she got ice cream today at work. She was very excited to show their appreciation for her. So grim. But also, it's the COVID pandemic, according to the World Health Organization, is no longer in a state of emergency. I think they said Friday is going to be the day, if I'm not mistaken. And so it's a great episode for us to kind of look back over the past 3 years and see how we've gotten to this point and what's coming ahead. The show's going to start a little bit differently today. We're going to show some pre-recorded videos of different healthcare workers around the world so we can kind of set the stage to see the different conditions that healthcare workers are facing. So first, we'll start with those videos.
At International Nurses Day, in Sweden, we are protesting against the healthcare system in permanent crisis. The main reason on the surface is an extreme lack of staff, especially nurses. The real reason behind it is the lack of decent working conditions. During the last 30 years, a huge part of the healthcare sector in Sweden has been opened up for privatization. The neoliberal course, with lean production just in time, balanced budgets, has led to a healthcare system that is not for the needs of the staff nor the population. Especially here in Stockholm, many hospitals and clinics are run by private, profit-making companies, but financed by public money. By opening up tax-funded care to private interests, companies are stepping in where the highest profit is promised, not the greatest benefit for the people. Less profitable care, such as women's health care, runs a deficit. So we have the absurd situation that while private companies in healthcare, including venture capitalists, can make profit, at the same time publicly hospitals and clinics are forced to make cuts. Closure of clinics and whole hospitals, especially in the north of Sweden, means that patients can be treated in corridors. Waiting time at emergency rooms can be up to 2 days until admission. All this has led to a situation with very high pressure at nurses and other staff. When nurses are missing, it's doubling the workload for those who are at place. There's a huge anger amongst nurses because of the ignorance and deafening silence of the establishment. Even more so, as this year's wage negotiations seems to end up around 2 to 3%, which you compare to rise of food prices of 20%. Many nurses are leaving the healthcare sector altogether. But what we need is turning this anger into protests. For the end of privatization and cuts, for a public healthcare system worth its name.
Aqui no Brasil, não é de hoje que os profissionais de saúde têm se dedicado arduamente nas suas profissões. Durante a pandemia, foram verdadeiros botes de salva-vidas. Muitos deles, infelizmente, tendo pago com a própria vida e vindo a óbito, perdendo a batalha contra a pandemia. Em troca, tudo o que receberam foram elogios vazios e palmas diante das janelas. Porém, a desvalorização, a baixa remuneração salarial e o excesso de carga horária de trabalho acentuaram. Na enfermagem, por exemplo, que é uma categoria predominantemente composta por mulheres, isso está escancarado e a categoria tem passado por várias situações e desafios. Entre eles, a falta de equipamentos de proteção individual, mas também as duplas, triplas jornadas de trabalho. Uma vez que o salário é baixo e eles não possuem piso salarial, precisam trabalhar em 2, 3, 4 e até mais espaços de trabalho para conseguir sobreviver. Se a gente pensar em outras categorias junto com a enfermagem, como os técnicos de enfermagem, os auxiliares e as parteiras, a gente vai perceber que essa é uma questão sintomática. A desvalorização desse trabalho, composto prioritariamente por mulheres, escancara também o quanto que o cuidado é desvalorizado dentro de uma sociedade capitalista. Atualmente, essas categorias estão em luta aqui no Brasil para a conquista do seu piso salarial através da PL 2564 de 2020, que tem sofrido grande resistência, principalmente por conta da base governista no Senado, mas também pelos grandes empresários da saúde. E a gente está aqui para defender essa categoria e relembrar que saúde não é mercadoria.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a nurse in a hospital in Ghent. I'm also a member of the LSP, which is the Belgian section of the ISA. Here in Belgium, also, the healthcare staff is really exhausted. There is still an enormous lack of staffing, which leads to hyper-flexibility for the workers, but also for long waiting lists for the patients. Neither hospital management nor the government can provide us with real solutions apart from very individualized solutions that are not going to solve this societal problem. They ignore the enormous lack of investments in healthcare, investments that are needed to provide good healthcare for the people, but also to provide good working conditions for the people working in healthcare. This makes a lot of healthcare workers very angry, and more healthcare workers are starting to build a movement from the ground up to try and push the unions into action. In Belgium, we had a huge demo of 22,000 healthcare workers and social workers at the 31st of January. This demo didn't give us the result we need, so we are mobilizing for a new demo the 13th of June. In the past, we as healthcare workers felt like we couldn't go on strike because we had a responsibility for our patients. But now more and more of us see the necessity of striking, not only for ourselves, but also for the patients. There is no lack of readiness to struggle. There is a lack of building a movement to a higher level. We need an action plan to win. Therefore, rank-and-file initiatives and structures to develop this movement should be supported by the union leadership for a democratic union to win this battle.
So for our first guest here with us, we have Anne, who's a member of the International Socialist Alternative in Germany. Hi, Anne. How's it going?
Hi, Toya. Nice for being here again.
Good to see you again. So I'm so happy you were able to come and talk with us. So first we wanted to talk about, the reports of healthcare sectors and even, richer countries in absolutely catastrophic situations. They're completely underfunded. They're completely understaffed. And, the workforce is exhausted, especially coming out of the pandemic. And so because of that, we're seeing countless numbers of deaths, unnecessary deaths, and it's actually hurting, the care that they're able to give to the patients. And also these workers are, leaving the field in desperation. So can you talk a little bit about what has led to this situation?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I was Googling it and I just wanted to see some reports on where does the care crisis actually come from. And it's so interesting that especially when you talk about the US, that the term, has been appearing in, studies from the 1980s already. And it refers exactly to the points that you were making, to massive debts that, former patients and so on are having, are piling up. And I think under neoliberalism, compared to the post-war period, the private care of often female workers has become an obstacle for the overexploitation in many countries, especially in the countries of the global north. And in the imperialist centers of the global value chains, more tech and white-collar workers are needed to manage and digest the commodities and capital flows from the extraction of value from other parts of the world. Hence, in the imperialist centers, we see a drive towards freeing female workers from domestic and unpaid care work and being replaced by mostly migrant workers from poorer parts of the world. And the female workers that employ other poor workers to clean their house, take care of their elderly and children, often work themselves in the care sector. And at the same time, the migrant workers who do this type of low-paid work left their care work when leaving the country to even poorer migrant workers or unpaid relatives such as younger siblings or older children. So the care crisis, even if you might not see it everywhere, it's definitely there, and the economic crisis of 2007, 2008 has increased the contradictions in the global social reproduction. So hospitals and other infrastructures have been privatized. You said it already, they have been closed down or exposed to severe cuts to save money for bailing out banks and the financial system. And the marketization of health has led to a dramatic decrease of care workers in the sector, as they are only profitable when running on solely a few bags. In hospitals, we see that in many countries, even every patient and its diagnosis has become has become a particular price. So it is called DRG, so diagnosis-related groups. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but it actually means that there's a fixed price, including the bed, the cleaning, the heating costs of the room, the food, the toilet, water, for every patient. And so in this type of calculation, squeezes profit out of care work. It's based on a global sum model. And actually, it's effectively, the same way of working in a car factory, basically. Or the idea is that it could be the same. And it's also based on kind of lean production, as you would have for cars or electronics. But hospitals, as we know, and in general, the care sector is different, differs in the very nature to these production industries. And when for several reasons, the patient, for instance, if there would be I also went through a lot of during my pregnancy, a lot of problems and so on. If you take more time to care, to heal, if there are complications and so on, then suddenly the hospital makes a loss with you, And in some hospitals in Germany, nurses then fought for more gloves or masks because these calculations were far too low to safeguard, a healthy working process. And just, to finish on that, who profits from that is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Au Pair. This is a large transnational corporation in elderly care based on France. And they employ about 71,000 carers globally. And there was a scandalous book turning out about them a few years ago, which called something like Grave Diggers. Because it's extremely inhumane, the working conditions and also the living conditions of elderly care. But this company, in the first half of 2022, their turnover went up by 10%, meaning that they made a total of 1.1 billion of profits. And also there's another large company which is called Fresenius Helios. And interestingly, in 2009, after the last big financial crash, they made about 107 million euro. And now until 2022, they have a 7 times higher profit. So about nearly 800 million now. And in Germany, workers regularly go on strike in Helios hospitals. And, and nurses report that the care is dangerous.
Thanks so much, Anne. I mean, the comparison you made to hospitals being some sort of manufacturing or factory in the way that they're trying to organize them, it really hits home because it shows how ridiculous under capitalism the capitalists look at healthcare. They try to cut corners and they give worse service to the patient or, in their mind, the consumer. But we're not just buying trinkets or cheap furniture, these are our lives. And so when they're cutting corners and making worse conditions for the healthcare workers themselves, like you said, no gloves, no masks, etc., they're gambling with people's actual lives. And it just shows the hypocrisy in the system. But you started to talk a little bit about the economy and the crash of some years back, and we're seeing this, happening again. Inflation is through the roof, and so what do you think that crisis, economically speaking, is going? What effect will that have in healthcare?
Yeah, of course, we can't predict everything. We are socialists, but still we have some ideas of what's happening. And I want to start with the point that you were saying, cutting corners. Most patients are workers, and a reason for an increasing number of patients were not only the pandemic, like COVID-19, but the increase in, it's often said there's an increase in living expectations. But actually, this is not the reason, it's the increase of work accidents. It's the increase of mental illnesses and burnouts over the past years. And for instance, and we know on the 28th of April, there's the International Workers' Memorial Day. And I mean, there are calculations of, more than 2 million workers dying a year just for, workers' accidents and so on. And for instance, in France, breast cancer is since this year accepted as a possible job-related illness. And the risk to get breast cancer is 30% higher for workers in night shifts. And most of night shift workers are in hospitals, cleaning, hospitality, and retail sector. Most of them are female and genderqueer. And that means, on the one hand, the danger to end up in hospital because of an over-exploiting, deregulating capitalist working system has increased. And on the other hand, hospitals have been prepared for years to become a new area for profit making. And this is only possible when turning them into an industry similar to a car factory or so. And we deal with the materiality of our world and the physical boundaries of nature, and industrialization of care can only go wrong and create a severe crisis, and hopefully also, and as we see already, also resistance movements to it. And we already see a class care system in which poor people have less access to care and on average die earlier from curable illnesses than rich people. Additionally, the illnesses that come with overexploitation on the labor market are not very very open for making a lot of profit out of them. Workers who have had accidents or whatever mental illnesses, they need, more doctors, more care, more medication, and more time to heal. And workers' illnesses are therefore not profitable enough and not cared enough for, so they end up in care sooner than it would be necessary. So it's a vicious cycle, basically. And workers are angry, and of course, a new crisis will pervert the global care chain even more. Right now, we see that care workers from the Philippines or Poland are transferred to countries in the capitalist centers and work for close to, forced labor conditions. I briefly spoke with Eoin about that. And, they have to, these workers have to pay the transfer. The labor agency often are forced to stay in the same care unit for up to 5 years. And then there are attempts also to break up, in Germany, the time breaks between shifts. So there's a mandatory rest that you have to take of 11 hours. But in the pandemic, the pandemic was really like a laboratory. They were, decreasing these time shifts to 9 hours. And also it became legal for this period, for a certain period, to prolong or to increase the number of working hours to 60 hours a week for care workers. So, and now we know that COVID-19 wasn't an emergency situation only because, or wasn't an emergency situation in itself, but it became an emergency because the situation in the health sector was already at the brink. And such laws, where they are playing with, making it even worse, will push more workers out of the sector. But as I said, we see a growing strikes in that sector. And today I read a really nice tweet from an assistant doctor. They are just now in the communal hospitals in Germany. They do new strikes right now. And he said, a strike is the greatest declaration of love to our health system and the only way it can get better. And I think an even bigger declaration of love to our health system is also to get rid of the private companies and of the capitalist system as a whole.
I think that's really, really true. I really love that, actually, the way you phrased it there. And I think, that's what I was going to say, that it's so terrible. And hearing what you're saying is so outrageous, like hearing how bad it's been in the health sector for so many decades, and especially in the recent period, and how it's basically become another business for people, because that's what the system does, right? That's what capitalism does. It makes everything into a business. And it's just so infuriating. But at the same time, we know that there's an antidote to that. We know that we can fight back. And I think that it's, especially in the healthcare sector, it's becoming clearer and clearer that a lot of people are aware of it, and a lot of people know that strikes and getting rid of the system is the way forward. So I'm really excited to talk to our next guest, who is Eoin from Northern Ireland. How are you doing, Eoin?
Hi, Yaara. I'm good, thanks.
So I was gonna ask you a little question about this. Like, can you give us a little overview of what's been happening on this, of the actions and the anger around the globe, and also explain what the key factors that are driving them are, and what the picture is looking like?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's been growing frustration amongst all health and social care workers for several years. Anne spoke about the fallout from the 2008 global financial crisis. And more recently, we saw some of the first expressions of that anger and that frustration here in Northern Ireland. In 2019, the RCN, which would be the main nursing union here, they went out on strike for the first time in their history. And they were joined by other health unions. And that was a strike over pay and staffing. And in many countries, falling staff levels over many years has created a growing crisis. There's a million vacancies in the European health system alone. The WHO found that staff shortages are stifling the African healthcare system. And in China, they're so desperate for staff that they have workers on wards despite having tested positive for COVID-19. And in some countries, boss simply lay off staff. So we saw that in Kentucky in the US. 150 workers were unceremoniously sacked and handed a pamphlet on grief. In the UK and in other parts of the world, they use a bit more of a subtle but an equally damaging approach. They simply don't train enough new staff. And as Anne mentioned as well, people are just leaving the industry to work elsewhere. So you see this emptying out of wards and of services and of the healthcare system overall. And staffing is just one aspect of the overall crisis in healthcare, but it's also a symptom of the other aspects. Falling wages mean that people are less attracted to work there and to remain there. Deteriorating working conditions and a lack of job security also drive people out of the field and towards other areas of employment. And so all of these factors together kind of set the scene for the catastrophes that we saw during the pandemic. And the experience of trying to work in a healthcare system whose primary goal is profit demonstrated so clearly to health workers and to the general public at large just how deeply flawed the system is. But on the flip side of that, since the pandemic, health workers are increasingly confident about their ability to strike and to win. Never before have we seen such a deep well of support for health and social care workers. We know we're worth more, both in terms of pay and working conditions, and the public are behind us for many reasons. But if for no other reason alone, that ordinary people and working class people want a decent healthcare system and understand that the current system doesn't offer that. And when you add to that, as if that wasn't enough, when you add to that the obscene wealth of the bosses and billionaires, many of whom have made their billions off the back of healthcare workers and patients, including during the pandemic, it's easy to understand just how angry healthcare workers are. And all of this comes now in the context of the cost of living crisis, which sees the billionaires continuing to profit. And what they've created is an absolute powder keg in healthcare all over the world. And we've started to see that anger being expressed in protest and industrial action all over the world. In Spain in January, we saw indefinite strikes in health in 5 out of the 17 regions. We had an 11-week strike take place in Westphalia in Germany, and shortly before that. And we've seen doctors and nurses taking strike action in Zimbabwe, Kenya, China, Argentina, the US. In Jharkhand, in India, we saw 10,000 health workers take an indefinite strike, and they were joined by a further 32,000 people in protest. And just last week, we saw members of my old union in Australia, the HSU in New South Wales, engaging in work stoppages. And while there has been some kind of wildcat strike action, we saw that in Alberta and Canada in 2020. Most of these struggles have been led by the trade unions. And the unions in the places that I've mentioned have played different roles. It would be unfair and inaccurate to paint them all with the same brush, but there have been kind of eerie similarities across the globe as well. And that eerie similarity is more often than not that the union leaderships act to hold back the truest expression of how health workers feel, the true fury that they feel, you know. So in the UK, we've seen unions taking strike on different days, and that softened the impact. And some of those unions recommended so-called pay deals that were in reality massive pay cuts. And to mention the HSU in Australia again, you know, their secretary, Jared Hayes, he described a few hours work stoppage as, quote, letting workers off the leash last year. And I think that describes really well how an awful lot of these so-called leaders view their members. You know, they don't view them as something to be represented. They view them as people to be restrained, to protect the bosses, to protect the politicians, and ultimately to protect profits. And what we really need to see now is union leaders doing what they're supposed to do, lead. You know, we don't want to see them holding back struggles or misleading struggles by recommending poor pay deals. We don't want workers left crossing one another's picket lines because they're striking on different days. And we don't want health workers to feel that they stand alone by failing to draw on that tremendous well of public support. You know, we need a union leadership that's answerable to the members through really robust democratic structures, but also through active workplace organisation. But most importantly, we need union leaders to lead a struggle which aims to win the absolutely vital demands if people are to continue or to ever have access to decent healthcare, and those are decent wages, decent terms and conditions for health and social care workers.
I think that's absolutely key. And, you know, especially what the thing that you're describing, how there's so much, you know, public support for the strikes, I think more than ever. But at the same time, there's so much pushback from the courts in a lot of countries. And then we have unions that in many places just aren't up to the task and are doing what they've been doing for the last few decades and not actually protecting the workers. It's essential that the solidarity is visible and exists in society and really pushes the struggle forward. And, you know, I think that another thing that we're seeing a lot, and I think that's every time there's a really big struggle in any sector, we're seeing that the people in those struggles are becoming politicized generally, not just about kind of the specific issues of their employment or their jobs. And I think that in healthcare, we're seeing it in particular. We're seeing how kind of healthcare professionals are getting organized in the workplace, but they're also playing a role in other really significant political movements and political struggles. So I was wondering, obviously this is a great thing, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that and how this can be strengthened and developed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from day one here in Northern Ireland, we've sought to link the demands around health and social care to wider demands, particularly around women's rights. Rosa here, the Socialist Feminist Organisation, produced posters which were put up around hospitals, and we distributed leaflets on picket lines on strike days, which linked the struggle for decent healthcare to socialist feminist demands. And demands around healthcare are just so fundamental to so many struggles. You know, how can we have a right to choose if safe abortion services aren't accessible? How can people in the US have a genuine right to choose to have children, knowing that doing so will place them in thousands of dollars of debt? How can we support trans and non-binary people who wish to have gender-affirming treatments without properly funded and appropriate services? And how can we help LGBT plus young people recover from the trauma of discrimination without properly funded mental health services? You know, the reality is that caring professions like those in health and social care are dominated by women, you know, and there's more than just a hint of sexism when we hear people being told that their job is a vocation, or, you know, and that they shouldn't really care about how much they get paid. You know, you should do it because you love what you do and you're a caring, kind person, you know, and those demands around pay are somehow secondary to that, you know. The reality too is that and particularly in developed Western economies, as Anne talked about, you know, many healthcare workers are migrants. So issues around pay, terms and conditions in health are also closely tied to demands for the decent treatment of migrants, both in workplaces and in society more generally. And one of the most heroic examples of workers in struggle has been the healthcare workers in Myanmar. They led the initial phase of struggle against the military coup there, and many of them paid the price for this with their liberty and indeed their lives. And you might ask yourself, like, what does a military coup have to do with healthcare? But it's so often that health and social care workers see the worst ills of the capitalist system. We're some of the most exposed people to it. We see the impact of a lack of abortion services. We see the impact on young people in particular of a lack of trans services and of mental health services for LGBT plus people. And we see these things, and that can be in a Western democratic system or a military junta in Southeast Asia. In a sense, it's all the same. It's all the worst ills of the capitalist system, and just the only difference is how they manifest in different countries and the severity of it. It's amazing that we're seeing these struggles linked in solidarity, and hopefully we'll see a continuation and a ramping up of that linking together of struggles, because it's those acts of solidarity that truly overcome, like, even the most deep divisions, when workers see themselves first and foremost as workers with common interests and in common struggle. So when we think about the breadth of the demands there, we talk about, we're talking about demands for equality, for LGBT people, for migrants, and even for basic democracy. We begin to see how the demands for a decent healthcare system in reality begins to bump up against the limitations of the capitalist system itself, and it's the linking up of those struggles that I've described there that can defeat capitalism. It's the only thing that can defeat capitalism. I spoke earlier about union leadership understanding what's necessary to win. Well, ultimately, that is what is necessary to win.
Thanks so much, Eoin. You talked about solidarity and how important it is. And we have a video actually from Ruth, who is in Ireland, sending solidarity to migrant workers there.
Ruth Coppinger from the Socialist Party in Ireland. On International Nurse Day, I want to send solidarity to nurses and midwives worldwide. The common feature of the work that you do is it's underappreciated, underpaid, undervalued. Here in Ireland, we had a national nurses' strike in 2019, and it was the first such national strike in a century. Huge public support, yet it failed to win what nurses deserved because the leadership did not fully realise the potential of that dispute. And we have a nursing crisis in Ireland as a result. And one of the features is that migrant nurses are being brought into our health service to plug those gaps. But migrant nurses are also being brought over here to work as healthcare assistants below their qualifications, below their abilities in our private nursing homes because insufficient numbers of people can be found here. The government has set up a special visa scheme and 1,000 workers were recently brought over. Here in the Socialist Party, we were approached by Migrant Nurses Ireland who were in touch with these nurses, and because of links that we have with them, they approached us for help and support, and we organised a Zoom call. More than 300 of those workers attended, and we heard their situation. Two key issues emerged. One was the fact that they are on a minimum wage of €27,000, which is below the threshold needed to bring your spouse or child to live with you while you work in the health service here doing essential vital work. This is obviously hugely distressing for the mainly women workers as well, many of whom are mothers having to leave their children behind. One worker spoke about trying to keep in touch with their child through Zoom calls in a different time zone. Most of the workers are Indian, some are Filipino, and many spoke at the meeting about also then being expected to do training for which they already have the qualifications, and insult to injury to pay for that training, €1,500 to €1,700. So through our Member of Parliament, Mick Barry, Socialist Party member in the Dáil, raised these issues in the Parliament. And yesterday we also organised a briefing where the workers spoke to members of parliament about their situation. We are trying to put on the pressure on the minister who set up the scheme to give these workers pay parity with the public sector. That would bring them over the threshold where they could have family reunification. We're also trying to scrap the ridiculous training, which is an insult to these workers. Our next step is to discuss with the workers, to further discuss with them about joining a trade union while they are healthcare assistants here. They're obviously not able to join the INMO, the Nurses and Midwives Union, which is very powerful and well organised. And thirdly, we're going to further publicise their case with press events, rallies and other things now that the workers have gotten a certain amount of confidence from their case being highlighted so far. We are in this situation because there's a care crisis under capitalism where workers are not valued enough, able to live with the high rents, the housing prices, the cost of living in their own countries. And many of these nurses, teachers, essential public sector workers leaving the profession due to stress or emigrating where there's better opportunities elsewhere. And in the case of these Indian nurses, they're actually forced to go abroad and sometimes work below their qualifications. We're going to continue to highlight the case for these workers and work closely with them. And once again, to send solidarity to all nurses, midwives and healthcare workers on this International Nurses Day.
So we have one last speaker, Sonja from Austria, who is a repeat guest on World to Win. So I'm excited to have you here. You recently wrote an article with Anne, who we spoke to earlier, which you can find on the International Socialist Alternative website, but it's titled Our Health, Their Crisis, Fight Back to Win, which I love and I can't wait to read. You know, we're having this episode talking about our, the week of, celebrating nurses and healthcare workers. But it can't just be this week or, May 12th. We need to build a whole fight back. So can you talk a little bit about what that will take?
Yeah, I think it takes, of course, a lot to gain some progress in that field. And the situations are very different, as we have heard. But I think there are some general demands and points that unify us in that struggle. So, for example, one of the recent reports of Oxfam was titled Profiting from the Poor, and it made clear that under Corona, the rich on the planet became even richer. It's especially in the last year, the companies in health, in housing, in producing food and energy companies who made huge profits. There are figures saying that since 2020, the profits of the billionaires on a daily basis grow by 2.7 billion per day. So there is obviously absolutely enough money on the planet to provide everybody with a free, quality public health and social care system, which can be easily paid by the profits of the rich people. And to go on, it's we are in a war situation, and a lot of money is spent on sorry, I have to start again. I mixed the second and the third question. Sorry. I just do the whole thing again, yeah? Sorry for that. Sorry. Okay, so a lot has to be done. That's very obvious. And the situations are different in the different countries, but there are some similarities. So if you read one of the last reports of Oxfam, it's titled Profiting from Pain, and it points to the fact that under Corona, the rich became much, much richer. And if you just look at the figure that since 2020, the billionaires, the really super rich on the planet, increase their wealth on a daily basis by $2.7 billion. That's especially people in also the health sector, like for example in Brazil, but also in the housing sector, banks, energy companies, food production. So it is obvious that there is enough money on the planet to provide everybody with free quality public health and social care. So that's possible. So that's one central demand, I think. But then also it's, as we have heard, health is a huge market. It's around 10% of the world GDP is somehow connected to the health market. And it's even became more profitable. It was shown under Corona with the development of the vaccines, how public money was used to create profit for a small number of companies and people. So again, it's necessary to, where it was privatized already, or where it is private, to take the whole sector in public hands and run and control it by the people themselves. There was recently, I read an article about the health crisis in Austria. And it started with saying, we talked to health economists, advisors, and others. And so the people they talk to is not the people who actually know what's going on in the sector, which is the nurses, the doctors, the people working there, but to health economists who look for profits. So when we talk about nationalization of the health sector, we also mean that it has to be run and controlled by the people themselves. So we say profit out of health and social care, no to privatization and big business profiteering, take the health care, social care, and of course the pharmaceutical companies into public ownership. That's the second demand that we would put forward. But then if you go on, how to finance all that? We are in a situation of increasing conflict on a world scale. And an enormous amount of money are put into the in the weapons industry. In the last year, worldwide, $2.2 trillion were spent on arms. And one region in the world, that's Europe, had an especially increase by 13% of spending on arms. So again, there is enough money. And they say they spend the money because it's for our safety. But it doesn't make our life more safe. At the same time, in England, Wales, and Scotland, if you have an emergency, it takes up to 93 minutes. That's 1.5 hours for an ambulance to come. Yeah, so that's not safe. So if we talk about safety, then it means to put much, much more money into the health sector, the social sector, but also education sector and so on. So we demand money for the healthcare and not for armaments, and massive investments in more staff with better pay, better working conditions, and of course also a shortening of the working hours to have a staff where you really have decent working conditions. So this is also extremely, extremely important. The health sector is a sector which is predominantly up to 70% female and a high rate of colleagues with a migrant background. And this is actually leading in a lot of countries to problems because while migrants are coming to, let's say, richer countries, they are then missing. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, it is a huge problem that health workers migrate to Western European countries where there is also a lack of staff. But then in Eastern Europe, you do not have enough staff there. And that's in big parts of the world, this is an increasing problem. So then also you have cuts in that sector, which then increase the amount of unpaid work for women. So the need for health and social care workers of all professions, of all genders, of all nationalities to work together is extremely important. And questions of rights for women, of rights for migrants must be central for the trade union movement to really have its full strength, not to be diverted, and to really be able to battle the battles, but also to win the battles. I'm coming from a country which used to have a reasonable good health system. But this is decreasing enormously. Also in Austria today, there is a huge health crisis. There is the situation that people have to wait for months before they get, for example, testing on cancer and things like that. So this is really getting to a deadly situation. And this shows that under capitalism, nothing which we probably gained some decades before is for sure. Everything can be taken away again for us. And this is because it is a system where the priorities are not on our needs, but where profits are definitely put over people. Where everything becomes a commodity, and this including our health and our bodies. And therefore, we need a socialist system that cares for the physical and the mental well-being of the vast majority, which is working class people and young people, and not takes profits, the profits of a tiny elite as the central thing in society. So these are some general but basic demands, I think, which are worth and necessary to struggle for. So on the 12th of May, the different ISA groups in the different countries all over the world have been taking activity. But we are not only doing that on that one day. We have been a part of struggles of health workers before, and we are part of health workers, social workers, the rest of the year as well. So if you want to join in that struggle, then you should be becoming a part of the struggle of the health workers, but also of the struggle of the ISA. For another society, a socialist society. So get in contact with us wherever you are to join the struggle for a socialist society.
Thank you so much, Sonja. I think I was gonna say that this episode was definitely not good for my hypochondria, but at the same time, I think the note that you finished on is really good to combat that, and to really see how we have a way forward. We can get rid of it. We just need to point at the things that are causing these issues, which I think we did really well in this episode, and then show the way forward to how we can actually fix it, which I think you really summed up really well there. So I want to thank you, Sonja, and also Eoin and Anne on the show, and obviously everyone who sent us videos to kind of share what's been happening in their countries. Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone who's been watching. But then now we're going to move to something that we haven't done in so long, which is the shout out of the week. So I'm really excited to share with you what it is today.
So for our shout out of the week, of course, we have to shout out May Day, which for everywhere else in the world, it's so much more exciting than here in the US because they like to celebrate it in September. But there were still some actions in my city. We saw some small actions. How was it for you for May Day in Europe, Yaara?
I mean, it's always really crazy depending where you go. But I think especially this year where we've seen, kind of the rise of the working class again, I think a lot of this episode talked about this in the health sector, but generally workers have been striking and fighting back and really realizing their power in a way that I don't think we've seen in previous years, at least in the last few years. So it's been a really exciting May Day, when we're thinking about all the strikes in France and in Britain. There was a general strike in Israel and Palestine. There was the union drives in Amazon. It's been a crazy year for workers. So I think it's, a really amazing May Day, and we really should, as workers everywhere, celebrate it and use it as a memento for the last year, but also as inspiration for the years to come.
Absolutely. I think if I could have been anywhere in the world this May Day, it definitely would have been France. I saw the videos. It's just so inspiring what the workers there are doing. But that's another episode for another day. Sonja did mention if you wanted to get involved with the International Socialist Alternative, you should. So please check out our website. We're located in many countries around the world. And if we're not located in your country, you should still reach out because maybe you can start a section there. I want to thank everyone. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and of course, check out our social media. You can see what we've been doing on Main Day around the globe. It's really cool. I've been scrolling like crazy, seeing what we've been doing on every continent, and it's so amazing to see everyone taking part in these movements.
It's super exciting. And so, yeah, thanks for watching our episode after we took a couple months off, but we are back in action. So make sure whether you watch us on YouTube or you listen to us on Spotify, podcasts, Apple Podcasts, whatever you do, make sure you share this video and tune in next time.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternative's YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!